Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Russia, 1812. What happens when the world's most ambitious emperor invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen, only to be defeated by snow, silence, and scorched earth? This is the story of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, a campaign that began with a handshake and ended with a frozen retreat. How did a diplomatic bromance between Napoleon Bonaparte and Tsar Alexander I turn into a geopolitical breakup of epic proportions? What made Napoleon cross the Niemen River with 600,000 men? Why did the Russians keep retreating, burning everything in their path? What happened at Smolensk, where victory came wrapped in flames? Napoleon gamble everything on a 5-week blitzkrieg and end up trapped in a land that refused to fight fair. Subscribe, turn on your notification, and stick around as we unravel the full campaign. From Inkovo's false start to Kutuzov's final stand, from Cossack ambushes to the Berezina crossing, and finally, the lonely ride of the emperor who returned alone. It all began in 1807, when Napoleon Bonaparte, fresh off his victory at Friedland, met Tsar Alexander I in Tilsit. Picture it. 2 emperors, 1 raft, floating on the Niemen River, exchanging compliments like high school frenemies at prom. They laughed, they hugged, they signed treaties. Napoleon even tried to marry Alexander's sister, Grand Duchess Anna Pavlovna, to seal the bromance. But the Romanovs weren't feeling it. After a year of royal ghosting, Napoleon married Marie-Louise of Austria instead. Ouch. Then came the Duchy of Warsaw. Napoleon carved it out of Polish territory like a slice of geopolitical cheesecake, and Russia was not amused. Poland had long been a thorn in Russia's imperial side, and now Napoleon was poking that thorn with a bayonet. To make matters worse, Napoleon annexed the Duchy of Oldenburg, ruled by Alexander's sister's father-in-law. That's right, he invaded the in-laws. If history has taught us anything, it's that you don't mess with the in-laws. Napoleon's grand plan to strangle Britain's economy was called the Continental System, a blockade so leaky it made Swiss cheese look airtight. Russia agreed to join the system at Tilsit, but it was a disaster. Russian merchants hated it, the economy tanked, and when Alexander resumed trade with Britain, Napoleon lost it, like full-on imperial rage. Both emperors accused each other of betrayal, diplomacy collapsed, and by 1811, Napoleon was done talking. He began assembling the largest army Europe had ever seen, because nothing says I'm mad like 600,000 troops marching toward your ex-ally's border. Napoleon's Grande Armée was less of an army and more of a multinational parade of reluctant participants. Polish corps led by Prince Poniatowski, dreaming of a resurrected Poland. German units from Saxony, Westphalia, and Bavaria, dressed to impress, but not always ready to fight. Italians, Swiss, Dutch, Croats, Spaniards, Portuguese, a buffet of uniforms and accents. Even Prussians and Austrians, Napoleon's former enemies, now awkward allies who showed up like guests at a wedding they didn't RSVP to. Some were seasoned warriors, others were glorified conscripts. The Prussians and Austrians, let's just say they packed extra maps in case they needed to accidentally wander home. Napoleon divided this behemoth into 3 armies, his own main force, because of course. One led by his stepson Eugene, Viceroy of Italy, who would prove surprisingly competent. One led by his brother Jérôme, King of Westphalia, who would prove less so. On the flanks, Marshal MacDonald with the Prussians on the left, General Schwarzenberg with the Austrians on the right, and Marshal Victor's 9th Corps in reserve, just in case things got spicy. Russia had only 220,000 troops to face this juggernaut. Outnumbered 2-1, they organized into Barclay de Tolly's First Army, stoic and strategic; Prince Bagration's Second Army, fiery and aggressive; General Tormasov's Third Army, holding the southern line. But Russia had 2 aces up its fur-lined sleeve. First, Sweden. Recently at war with Russia, was now ruled by Bernadotte, a former French marshal turned Swedish crown prince. When Napoleon occupied Swedish Pomerania without so much as a by your leave, Bernadotte flipped the imperial bird and promised neutrality to Russia. Second, Russia signed peace with the Ottoman Empire, ending a 6-year southern conflict. That freed up troops and focus for the northern showdown. Before Napoleon's boots even touched Russian soil, Tsar Alexander I had pulled off 2 diplomatic masterstrokes. First, he made peace with the Ottoman Empire, ending a 6-year southern war. Second, he secured neutrality from Sweden, ruled, ironically, by Napoleon's ex-marshal Bernadotte, who was still salty over Napoleon's surprise occupation of Swedish Pomerania. With his flanks secured, Alexander could now focus all his frosty attention on the French juggernaut heading his way. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée began crossing the Niemen River into Russian territory. The army was so massive, the crossing took 5 days. That's not an invasion, it's a parade with logistical anxiety. Napoleon's plan was textbook brilliance: strike north of the Prat marshes, crush Barclay de Tolly's First Army, while his brother Jérôme pinned down Prince Bagration's Second Army. Then swing south and trap Bagration like a bear in a snare. Napoleon expected to wrap this up in 5 weeks. Russia, however, had other plans that involved retreating, burning everything, and letting nature do the dirty work. Barclay, cautious and calculating, saw the size of Napoleon's force and said, "Nope." He began a strategic retreat, torching villages and crops behind him. Bagration, more of a charge first, ask later kind of guy, grumbled but agreed. The Russians weren't going to fight, they were going to starve the invaders. Napoleon reached Vilnius in 4 days, expecting a showdown. But Barclay had ghosted him. To the south, Jérôme failed to pin Bagration, who slipped away like a seasoned escape artist. Napoleon was furious. Jérôme, humiliated and stripped of command, packed his royal bags and sulked back to Westphalia. Napoleon had planned for supply depots and transport units to feed his army. But Russia's roads weren't roads, they were mud rivers. Summer thunderstorms turned wagon trails into quagmires. The army had to stop constantly just to let supplies catch up. This was great news for exhausted conscripts, but terrible for Napoleon's timetable. Men began dropping out, some from sheer exhaustion, others from the realization that marching through Russia wasn't as glamorous as the recruitment posters promised. Desertion spiked. Command and control over this multinational monster became a nightmare. The Grande Armée, once famed for its speed, now moved like a bloated snail in a swamp. Napoleon paused at Vilnius, regrouped, and resumed the chase. Barclay continued his retreat to Vitebsk, hoping to link up with Bagration, but Davout blocked Bagration at Saltanovka, forcing him to reroute to Smolensk. Napoleon clashed with Barclay's rearguard at Vitebsk, but once again, the Russians vanished, after burning their supplies like pyromaniac magicians. Meanwhile, 300 miles south, Russia's Third Army attacked and defeated the Saxon Seventh Corps, forcing Napoleon to divert Schwarzenberg's Austrians to plug the hole. The campaign was unraveling like a poorly stitched uniform. By late July, Napoleon had marched 250 miles into Russia, farther than planned, with no major battle. But the toll was brutal. 20% casualties from exhaustion and disease, especially typhus and dysentery. 250,000 horses entered Russia. They began dying at 1,000 per day from lack of fodder and overwork. These weren't just cavalry horses, these were the engines of transport, and their deaths crippled logistics. Napoleon's army was now a limping leviathan, dragging itself deeper into a land that refused to cooperate. Just when things couldn't get worse, Napoleon's light cavalry met their match. The Cossacks. These weren't your average horsemen, they were ghosts on horseback. Ruthless, self-reliant, and allergic to conventional warfare. Every day they shadowed the French, swooping in for ambushes, then vanishing into forests. Alongside Russian partisans, they attacked supply lines, depots, and isolated units. Napoleon had to divert thousands of troops just to protect his rear. French patrols couldn't scout, roads were unknown, enemy positions were a mystery. Napoleon was marching blind. Napoleon stayed 16 days at Vitebsk, resting and brooding. His flanks were dangerously exposed. But then came good news. Schwarzenberg had defeated the Russians at Gorodechna. At Polotsk, a French-Bavarian force fought Wittgenstein's Russian First Corps to a standstill. For now, Napoleon's flanks were secure. But the center? That was still a long, burning road to Smolensk, and beyond that, Moscow. By August 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée was limping, wheezing, and shedding soldiers like dandruff in a snowstorm. Half its original strength gone, but Napoleon? Still charging ahead like a man who'd bet his empire on a coin toss. His eyes were now set on Smolensk, a city steeped in Russian history and holy significance. He wanted a decisive battle, something to finally pin down the elusive Russian army and declare, voila, victory. Meanwhile, Barclay de Tolly, Russia's master of strategic hide-and-seek, was under pressure. Prince Bagration was breathing down his neck, demanding action. Emperor Alexander, sipping tea in St. Petersburg, insisted Russia's honor was on the line. Morale was sagging. The troops were tired of playing tag with Napoleon. So Barclay finally said, "Fine, let's dance." The Russians launched their offensive with General Platov's Cossacks, who galloped into Inkovo and gave a French cavalry division a rude awakening. It was a promising start, until Barclay got spooked by false reports that Eugene's 4th Corps was flanking him to the north. He called off the attack. Just like that. Russia's big moment turned into a puff of smoke. Napoleon, watching from his imperial tent, probably chuckled. So that's it, too? Now, it was Napoleon's turn to shine. He launched the Smolensk maneuver, a classic Bonaparte move. Using Murat's cavalry as a smokescreen, he slithered south, crossed the Dnieper River with pontoon bridges like a military magician, and aimed to cut off the Russian retreat. Marshal Davout crossed at Orsha, while a lone Russian division, the 27th, fought like lions at Krasny, buying precious time for Bagration to reinforce Smolensk. Napoleon could have struck fast. But instead, he paused for a birthday parade. Yes, really. The man halted his army to celebrate turning 43. Take before conquest. 2 days later, Napoleon launched a frontal assault. 150 French guns roared. 3 corps smashed into Smolensk's medieval walls. The Russians fought like demons. But Barclay, fearing encirclement, ordered another retreat. Smolensk was set ablaze. The French entered the city to find ashes, rubble, and ghosts. Bagration's army slipped away first. Barclay's rearguard got caught at Valutino by Marshal Ney's 3rd Corps. But General Junot, commanding the Westphalian 8th Corps, was supposed to cut off Barclay's retreat. Instead, he crossed the river and did nothing. Napoleon was livid. Junot will never get his marshal's baton, he snarled. Ouch. Smolensk cost 10,000 casualties. One of Russia's holiest cities was reduced to cinders. But strategically, nothing changed. The Russians escaped. Again, Napoleon paused. His men were exhausted. The season was turning. He considered wintering in Smolensk and resuming the campaign in 1813. But then he looked east. Moscow, just 230 miles away. Not the capital anymore, but still Russia's beating heart, a prize too tempting to ignore. Napoleon, ever the gambler, pushed on. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexander had a spiritual awakening. He declared the war a crusade to save Holy Mother Russia from the Antichrist, aka Napoleon. The Russian people rallied. The stakes were now divine. Alexander needed a new commander. Enter General Mikhail Kutuzov, a grizzled veteran, beloved by the troops and a true Russian. He'd lost to Napoleon at Austerlitz, but since then had thrashed the Ottomans and earned his stripes. Kutuzov agreed with Barclay's strategy of delay, but he knew morale was crumbling. If Moscow fell without a fight, Russia's soul might go with it. So he chose a battlefield. 70 miles west of Moscow, near the village of Borodino, the Russian army dug in. Trenches, redoubts, and cannon placements stretched across the landscape. Europe was about to witness the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars, a clash of empires, egos, and endurance. On September 7, 1812, near the village of Borodino, Napoleon and Kutuzov finally collided. The Russians had dug in with redoubts, trenches, and artillery placements. Napoleon, eager for a decisive blow, launched a full-scale assault. It was a bloodbath. Over 250,000 troops clashed in a single day. Casualties soared past 70,000, the bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. The Russians fought with ferocity, refusing to break. Napoleon, unusually cautious, held back the Imperial Guard, his elite reserve force. By nightfall, the Russians withdrew, but not in panic. Kutuzov had preserved his army. Napoleon had won the field, but not the war. Napoleon marched into Moscow expecting surrender, peace, and a warm imperial welcome. Instead, he found a ghost town. The city was abandoned. Fires broke out, some say deliberately set by Russian agents. 3/4 of Moscow burned. Napoleon waited and waited. No envoys, no peace, just smoke and silence. By October, with no Russian surrender and winter closing in, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. What followed was one of the most harrowing journeys in military history. Freezing temperatures, starvation, Cossack raids, disease and desertion. Horses died by the thousands. Soldiers froze in their sleep. Cannons were abandoned. The Grande Armée, once 600,000 strong, was reduced to a shattered remnant. In late November, the French reached the Berezina River, only to find the Russians waiting. Napoleon's engineers built makeshift bridges under fire. Thousands drowned. Thousands more were killed, but a portion of the army escaped. It was a miracle and a massacre. Napoleon abandoned his army and raced back to Paris. He needed to preserve his image, his empire, and his throne. The Russian campaign had cost him everything: prestige, manpower, and momentum. Europe smelled blood. The coalition reformed, and within 2 years, Napoleon would be forced to abdicate. Like your history bold, brutal, and brilliantly told? Subscribe now and hit that so you don't miss the storm that's about to break at Borodino. The battlefield awaits.